should you freak out and start going crazy? Were you doing things you shouldn't be doing? What's wrong with Docker being a container engine inside Kubernetes? I have a solution. Docker is gone. Kaput. No more. Actually, that is not really true. Docker is alive and kicking, but it's gone from your Kubernetes clusters. And you heard that. You certainly heard about that. Docker has been deprecated in Kubernetes 1.20 and will be removed in 1.22. But that is not true either. Dockershim is deprecated, and Dockershim is the thingy that transforms Kubernetes calls to OCI compliant API because Docker cannot speak OCI. So anyway, let's cut it short. Docker is gone from your Kubernetes cluster and very much alive and kicking outside of Kubernetes clusters on your laptop and stuff like that. But what I want to discuss is not how you should use Docker on your laptop. You know that stuff. I want to discuss what happens now that Docker is deprecated and soon to be removed. Again, a mistake. Dockershim is deprecated and beat it Docker as well. So what happens now? What should you do? What shouldn't you do? Should you be just calm or should you freak out and start going crazy? I am going to split this into a couple of sections. First, I want to talk about some myths and misunderstandings around what Docker is and what is its role in Kubernetes cluster. Then I'm going to talk about how all that works and what the heck is happening. After that, we're going to jump into what should you, me, somebody do now that Docker is no more. And then comes my favorite part. We are going to go through Q&A. I received a bunch of questions from different people. I will not be able to answer them all, but I will answer a few that I think are very, very important. So stick to the end because that Q&A, answering the questions that you might be asking as well, is likely the best part of this video. Over time, Docker became synonym for containers. We do not say, hey, I want to run some containers. Hey, I want to build some images. We say, hey, I want to run Docker. I want to build Docker images. But that is one of the big problems because it's not really Docker. Docker is just one of the many different implementations. Arguably, Docker is the one that made containers available to the masses, but it's definitely not the only one. And it's slowly fading away and finding its place back into your laptops, but not really in your clusters. So the important part to understand is that when you say we're building Docker images, you're doing it wrong. You should be saying we are building container images. And when we say we are running Docker, no, we are running containers. Now, whether it's Docker or something else building images, that's a separate question. And whether it is Docker or something else running your containers, again, separate question. And the important part here is that for you, dear user, what is running your containers is irrelevant. What is building your container images is also irrelevant. And actually, no, that's also wrong. It's not irrelevant. It's very important how you build your container images because you're most likely not going to do that with Docker, at least not inside of your clusters. I mean, on your laptop you can use Docker, but inside of your cluster, no. You need to figure out a way how to build container images using something that can run inside of your containers because everything in your clusters is based on containers. And you need to figure out how to run those containers, actually how to enable Kubernetes to run those containers, and it needs to be something else as well for a simple reason, because Dockershim is deprecated, will be removed, or maybe it's already removed by the time you're watching this. So we need to figure out a couple of things, how we run our containers, or which container engine are we using inside of Kubernetes clusters to run our containers, and how we build our container images inside Kubernetes cluster. And by the way, you will probably notice that I'm saying container, not Docker, because Docker is just one implementation. It's no more. It's gone from the cluster. Now, the last thing I want to debunk and this is mostly about linguistical issues. People say, hey, we are using Kubernetes to run Docker. Again, wrong. Kubernetes is not running Docker. Kubernetes is not running anything actually. Container engine is running containers, and Kubernetes is instructing container engines to run containers. And it is doing that through something called OCI. But hey, we're going to discuss that in a couple of minutes. We're getting there. So how does all that work? What is that symbiosis between Kubernetes and containers, Docker or something else? Now, Kubernetes does not run containers. Kubernetes is using a container engine of choice, whichever one you choose, as long as it works, and instructing it to run containers. Kubernetes is a scheduler. Kubernetes has an API, receives instructions through that API, and it's performing some actions. And those actions, at the end of the day, or at least the most important one, is to schedule pods, and pods are collections of one or more containers. And it is doing all that by figuring out which node is the best candidate to run your container, and then going to that node, to that server, and instructing container engine how to run a container, and actually which container to run and with which parameters and what's not. And it is doing that through OCI. Kubernetes does not even know or doesn't even care what is the entity, what is the engine that runs your containers. No, it's irrelevant. That is completely irrelevant for Kubernetes. What matters is that Kubernetes understands or assumes that whatever is running your containers is implementing OCI, because it is a standard interface. And then Kubernetes says, hey, I'm sending this information on the interface, the standard interface, OCI. I hope that some engine is listening to it, and I hope that that engine will respond to me with okay or not okay. So even if it's not okay, I will try to figure out something else. And in that way, Kubernetes is really decoupled from container engines. As long as some container engine implements OCI, it can be used in a Kubernetes cluster. And Docker doesn't. Containerd, which happens to be part of Docker, we're getting there as well, does. Now that we are talking about OCI, it has two sets of interfaces, and one of them is for building container images. And this is similar like container engine. We can build container images based on OCI with Docker, but also with other tools. We can use Canico, we can use Builda, we can use quite a few others. And it doesn't matter really which one we use, because we are not building Docker-specific image, we are not building Canico-specific image, we are building images compliant with OCI. So what matters is whether that image builder fulfills our requirements. And the most important requirement, almost certainly the most important requirement, is whether that container image builder can run from inside of containers. And that is important, because if we are delegating to Kubernetes all our processes, we want some of those processes to be building images. And since all those processes are running in containers, then building images needs to be inside of containers as well. Easy. Was that clear? Does that feel now? Does that make you feel better? Probably doesn't, because I didn't get to the part, what should you do, what should I do, what should we all do? And the answer to that, what should we do now, can be an easy one or a very complex one. And whether it's going to be easy or basically no need to do anything or complex depends on what you were doing so far. Did you do some nasty stuff? Were you doing things you shouldn't be doing? That is the real question. Forget about Docker. Did you do things you shouldn't be doing? Because if you did, then you might be in deep trouble. In other words, if you were a good boy or a girl and you did the right things, as you should have been doing, you can stop watching this. There is nothing to worry about. You will be able to live without Docker. You will not even know that Docker ever existed, if that's your desire, if you really want to forget. I mean, there is no need to forget about Docker. It's still useful on laptops, but in Kubernetes, gone. On the other hand, let me explain what do I mean by maybe you were doing some nasty things. For example, do you have processes that mount sockets from your containers to, let's say, Docker process, Docker daemon? Many of you do. Are you trying to circumvent containers and go outside and do stuff you shouldn't? That's actually the real question. Because if you're mounting sockets, if you're mounting volumes to nodes, if you're running in privileged mode, all that is telling me that you're not happy using containers only, but you're using containers and then getting out to do things on the nodes you shouldn't. And many of those things are related with communication with Docker. If that's what you're doing, you might be in a bit of a trouble, because you might need to get rid of those things. I mean, you should never have done it, but you did. And if you did, then now you need to pay the price. Think of it as technical debt that now you need to pay off, right? You had a party that lasted a couple of years, and now the party is over and you have a hangover. That's what's happening when you have too much of the good stuff. So you need to get rid of those things. You need to get rid of any direct, indirect, whichever type of communication with Docker, because you were never supposed to have those things. You were supposed to run processes inside of containers and only inside of containers. So let me answer a couple of your questions, and I will have to read the questions, so my eyes are going to focus in a different direction for a second. And the first one is, can container images be built with Docker locally, but run as containers using some other container runtime? Yes, absolutely, no doubt. And I think that's the mental problem that we are all having, that we somehow think that, hey, if I built this image with Docker, then I need Docker inside of Kubernetes to run those images, to convert them into containers. But that's absolutely not true, because Docker is building OCI compliant images. And OCI compliant images, remember, OCI is Open Container Initiative. So Docker is building OCI compliant images, and that means that they can be run by any other container engine that is OCI compliant, which is almost all of them actually. The only one that is not OCI compliant, but not for running images, but for having an API, OCI API, is Docker actually. And here's another one. Why did Kubernetes deprecate Docker? Because it was painful to have it. Let me explain. Initially, when Kubernetes project started, Docker was hard-coded throughout an important chunk of Kubernetes code. And then Kubernetes community created something called Dockershim, which is basically an interface that translates OCI requests from Kubernetes into something that Docker understands. And that was intermediary period, because it was agreed already by then that we'll communicate to container engines using OCI. And then we got different container engines. I'm going to mention them soon. But the important part is that it was just intermediary solution. Now Docker does not implement that interface, and it's out, because for a simple reason, because community does not want to manage, maintain, spend time on maintaining Dockershim. And that's the translator, that's how it's called. So why would a community spend time maintaining translator if actually we all agreed that OCI interface will be used, right? So it's up to each container engine project or community or vendor to actually implement that interface. But that was not the only reason why Dockershim was deprecated. Another one is very much related with the next question, so let me read it. What's wrong with Docker being a container engine inside Kubernetes? There is a lot of wrong why Docker shouldn't be container engine running containers inside of your Kubernetes cluster. And that is mostly because it's too big. It is doing too many things that we do not need inside Kubernetes. So for example, The Docker manages volumes, Docker manages networking, Docker contains Docker Swarm, which is orchestrator itself. Basically, it is equivalent to Kubernetes, and so on and so forth. So Docker is huge, and it's okay that it's huge because it is doing a lot of things for us, but on our laptops. Now, all of those things are not needed, are not used when using Kubernetes, and even when they are used, they use very different logic. So basically, using Docker as container engine inside of Kubernetes means that you're having 90% of the stuff you don't need. The only thing that container engine needs, that's to run containers and nothing else, no networking, no storage, none of those things, run containers and implement OCI interface. Docker is not doing the latter, and Docker has too many things. It is too heavy for no good reason. And now comes the interesting one. So let me read that one as well. What are the alternative candidates for a container engine inside Kubernetes? That's a good question. And a question that many of you should not care. You do not need to care about what is container engine for a simple reason, because many of you are using managed Kubernetes. You're using already predefined, pre-built platform. If you're using AKS on Azure, if you're using GKE on Google, if you're using, I don't know what else, EKS on AWS, if you're using managed Kubernetes in DigitalOcean, if you're using OpenShift in your own data center, and so on and so forth, somebody else already made a choice what container engine is, and whatever the container engine is what you're going to use, because it doesn't matter for you as a user. As a sysadmin, maybe, probably, but for you as a user, it doesn't. What matters is that you're interacting with Kubernetes, and what Kubernetes does behind the scenes and how it generates containers and so on and so forth is not your concern. That's Kubernetes' concern. That's why we love Kubernetes, because it abstracts the complexities of managing the system by exposing an API, and the only thing we care really, actually not all of us, but most of us, is that we have an API. That's Kubernetes API. We tell it what to do, and it's up to Kubernetes to figure it out. And among other things, it's up to Kubernetes to do the stuff with containers. You shouldn't care about it. And even if you do, in most Kubernetes platforms, you don't have a choice which container engine to use. And by the way, Docker is not in most of the managed Kubernetes platforms anyways. Actually, it was, but not anymore now that it's officially deprecated. But if you do care, if you're system admin or somebody, maybe somebody who is creating or managing Kubernetes cluster with kubeadm, then probably the best option is containerd, because it's battle tested. It was created by Docker company as well. It is part of Docker. So containerd is already inside of Docker, except that that's the only part of Docker you need for running containers. So probably, if you ask me for opinion, switch to containerd. If you want alternatives, there's plenty of them. Probably the most popular one would be CRI-O, CRI-O. I will post all the links are in the description. That is basically the default choice, or maybe the only choice in OpenShift, and so on and so forth. There are many of them. Most of us don't care. If you do care, then containerd, the first choice, CRI-O probably the second, and then Google for the rest. So here's another one. How does the change from Docker to something else affect me as a Kubernetes user? For most of us, it doesn't. It's not affecting you. Unless, and remember from the beginning of this video, you did things that you were never supposed to do. Mounting sockets, privilege modes, and so on and so forth. Trying to be clever and to do things that are not really well seen by Kubernetes, or does not follow the logic of Kubernetes. It's not really running exclusively in containers and what's not. If you were not doing those things, you're safe. If you were doing silly things, then step number one, ask yourself, why were you doing silly things? Step number two, think of it as being technical debt. You did something you were not supposed to do. Now you need to remove it. And the major stumbling block in most cases, the major problem for most people is building container images. And remember, I'm not saying Docker images, container images from inside of Kubernetes clusters. And for that, I have a solution, and that solution is called Kaniko. There are many other solutions, but Kaniko is my preference. And if you don't know what Kaniko is, there's the link. There's the link somewhere in the corner. Check it out. Kaniko is the way how you can build container images from inside of containers without sockets, without privilege mode, without any of those things. That's it. Those are the most important questions. Those are the most important topics. You know what to do. Actually, there is almost nothing to do. Use Kaniko or something similar to build your container images. Make sure that you're not mounting sockets and running in privileged mode and things like that. You were never supposed to do that. And let your provider choose container engine. If you're using GKE, that's containerd already. I think that EKS is containerd. Maybe your provider already changed from Docker to something else without you even knowing. And as I said before, and I'm going to repeat it for the 5th time, if you were doing things you were not supposed to do, and that's mainly sockets and privilege mode, then hey, you have a debt to pay. Thank you so much for watching. This was not my typical video. I just thought that I should record this. This sounds like something that many people are asking. So I don't know whether this was helpful, but in any case, subscribe to the channel, please, please, please. Click the bell icon, bell to get notifications, and the thumbs up to say that this was an awesome video, if you think it was. And the only thing left is to bid you farewell. See you in the next video. Cheers, bye, ciao, pa.